After I first saw this, I was able to say that I watched The Watchmen. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel and another installment of my Zack Snyder review series, where I'm going through all of Zack Snyder's films that I have yet to review for my channel. And today we're talking about his third film, Watchmen. Let me know before we begin what your thoughts on Watchmen were in the comments below, and make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these reviews, as it helps me out immensely by getting my channel out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with reviews of new releases, older films, hidden gems, and so much more on a near daily basis. But let's jump right into it and let's talk about Watchmen. This takes place in 1985, where former superheroes exist. The murder of a colleague sends active vigilante Rorschach, played by Jackie Earle Haley, into his own sprawling investigation, uncovering something that could completely change the course of history as we know it. Just so you know, as I've been doing with the other reviews in this series, this will contain spoilers. So, if you haven't seen Watchmen and you wish to know nothing, this is your spoiler warning. Go watch the movie, then come back to this. But anyway, here we go. Based on the classic comic book series of the same name by Alan Moore, this was in development hell since 1987 after the series wrapped up. Directors like Darren Aronofsky, Tim Burton, and Paul Greengrass were all attached at one point or another, and then left for various reasons. And at one point, Terry Gilliam was attached, but also left, and he famously called the comic unfilmable. And for a while, it gained that reputation, and that's because Moore had catered the story to the specific medium of comic books. I read the series a long time ago in preparation for seeing the movie for the first time, and the thing is dense. If you haven't read it, it's definitely worth reading, but you'll see there are certain visual cues that were specifically geared towards the comic book format. There's even one chapter that's called Fearful Symmetry, where each page has a corresponding page later in the chapter where it'll be in the same setting, but the action's different, and it acts as something of a palindrome. And this is on top of the fact that there were complex subplots thrown in there, as well as rich, layered backstories that were explored in between the main story, usually bookending a chapter in the form of a letter or a case file. It was a lot to condense into even a 3-hour movie, on top of scenes that wouldn't have worked as well in movie form. But Zack Snyder, who was approached after Warner Bros. Saw 300, managed to do what many thought was impossible to do, and I'll give him a lot of credit. While the movie's far from perfect, and we'll get more into that in a moment, he still managed to do an impressive job in my view. Stylistically, this is very reminiscent of 300. Like that film, much of this was filmed on sound stages or with green screen backgrounds. Even New York City was not actually filmed in New York City, but rather in Vancouver, with a set built to replicate New York, or at least a more stylized version of New York. Like 300, Snyder once again goes for that comic book feel, and he even brings back cinematographer Larry Fong, who worked with him on the previous film, to give off that same feel here. While Watchmen is meant to be a very grounded deconstruction of the superhero genre, utilizing real-life figures and making references to a number of historical events, Snyder still makes it clear this is a fictionalized setting. Even though the film takes place in the 80s, with this being an alternate timeline, there are things like Richard Nixon still being president of the United States and the Cold War still going on, leading to a combination of two different generations of pop culture blended into this new, odd look that feels distinctly comic book-like. And it's supported by some notable pop culture references when depicting those settings, like the War Room looking like the Doctor Strangelove War Room, and part of the Vietnam War being played out very similarly to a scene from Apocalypse Now, as well as various noteworthy 60s songs filling up much of the soundtrack. So from a visual standpoint, once again, Snyder excels. Some of the shots here are beautiful and do give this film something of an epic feel, despite the grounded nature of the original story. Snyder does utilize his usual slow-mo here, but it's not distracting. While it's used frequently, it's also not overdone, as it wasn't used during moments where it wasn't necessarily warranted, often being reserved for either more shocking moments or for dramatic effect during pivotal scenes, like, say, some of the characters dressing up for the first time in a while. Probably the best instance of it, though, was over the opening credits, as we hear Bob Dylan's The Times They Are Changing playing over pivotal moments during the Watchmen's early days, as well as those of the precursor team known as the Minutemen. This was especially an effective way of cramming a lot of backstory into just a few minutes, and making it not too jarring. While it's a lot to take in at once, the way Snyder and cinematographer Fong hone in on those moments perfectly sets the tone for the rest of the film. As for the story itself, I will preface this with the fact that, before sitting down with it for this review, I haven't seen the movie in about 10 years or so, and the way I viewed it back then is much different than I did now. When I first saw this, I loved it, And for a while, I even thought of it as Zack Snyder's best work. And I think part of that may have been due to what sort of movies were popular at the time. This was released a year after The Dark Knight was released, and at a time when the gritty, hyper-realistic takes on superheroes, and just major franchises in general, were incredibly popular, especially as the Marvel Cinematic Universe was still in its infant stages by this point. So, considering the original comic book series was already hyper-realistic and dark, it was released at the right time, because those were the sort of movies I, and honestly most people, gravitated towards. You had the jaded Rorschach giving this narration about how he's disgusted with everything. You had a very cynical view of reality presented here in a mostly darker color palette, among other things. And I can see why I loved it at the time. And while I know the reception in general towards this at the time was polarizing, I also understand why those who loved it. Looking at it now, when that's not what I'm looking for so much in a movie, it's easier to see some of the problems. Though, to be clear, I still like the movie overall. I still think the good vastly outweighs the bad. It's just, there are a lot of gray areas here, which is kind of the point of the story. It's just that there are still issues that are noticeable after you get over the awe of seeing this ultra dark, different kind of superhero movie that was popular at the time. As I mentioned earlier, Watchmen's a grounded deconstruction of the superhero genre. The superheroes we see here aren't meant to be like your typical Superman or Spider-Man or whoever else. You find out early on how they're treated as nothing more than mass vigilantes, and public perception towards them becomes negative. And after mass vigilantes are outlawed, a number of them wind up working for the government, basically as a way of looking out for themselves, and we discover they do some pretty heinous stuff. These are meant to be very morally complex, and in some cases outright terrible, people. For example, you take the comedian, played by Jeffrey Dean Morgan, who at first you kind of feel for as he's murdered in his very first scene, and you think of him as your typical superhero at first, but as the film dives deeper into his history, as it relates to some of the main characters, you realize how awful of a person he was, being abusive behind closed doors, and a straight-up murderer in some instances. And any empathy you may have briefly had for him from that opening moment is quickly stripped away, even if he was once part of a well-respected team. We even see the harm a number of these heroes can cause, even when they're not doing it intentionally, which is a theme Snyder would go on to explore once again with his DCEU films. When they get into a fight, the violence is pretty graphic, with things like bones breaking, blood flying all over the place, and when they're called in to help, we're meant to look at the destruction they leave in their wake, and we're supposed to question if they're really doing more harm than good. And all of that, along with the way these characters view the world or fit into the world, is meant to put them all almost at an arm's length from the audience. With some exceptions, they're not all meant to be people you have this real connection with or you can easily root for. Even Rorschach, who's the guy that we're supposed to be following for most of the film, as we hear his narration through journal entries, isn't someone we'd call relatable, since, as suggested by the mask he wears, he sees the world as very black and white, and while he's someone who does want to do the right thing, he also doesn't leave room for nuance where needed. He sees the world in extremes. Basically, what I'm getting at is, making all these characters morally complex or somewhat detached from humanity is the point of Moore's original series, and in the comics it works because of both how he utilizes the comic book format to tell the story, as well as the fact that he has more time to flesh out these characters, but in movie form, it doesn't translate quite as well, partially due to the time constraints, and also partially due to the nature of the characters themselves. Having a film where all of your main characters aren't relatable or morally complex doesn't make for the most emotionally resonant narrative. The film replicates the extremely dark tone of the comics, and again, I understand that's the point of the story, but it would definitely feel like a bit much at times, especially because a lot of these characters are meant to be cold and cynical. While it works because of its execution in comic book form, it might just be one of those things that doesn't work as well on screen. You have Rorschach, who, as I mentioned, views the world in a very black and white way. You also have Ozymandias, played by Matthew Goode, who went from being a vigilante to a billionaire who is almost always cooped up in his headquarters, which still makes him detached from the rest of the world. Plus, you have Dr. Manhattan, played by Billy Crudup, who is seen as the Superman of the group, but is utilized as a weapon and comes off as very robotic and barely feels humane, which is especially captured by Crudup's delivery. And you're left with the two most likable characters being Silk Spectre, played by Malin Ackerman, and Night Owl, played by Patrick Wilson. Both of them took up their respective mantles from older heroes. When we first see them, they're both retired after mass vigilantism becomes outlawed, though there's still clearly this bit of detachment from the rest of humanity, as they haven't fully fit in with everyone else, so it still doesn't make them the easiest characters to follow. Even during moments that are meant to be warmer, there's still this underlying distance when they speak. But they do manage to be something of a moral center for the story, especially Silk Spectre, who doesn't look back fondly on her days as a superhero. But despite everyone not being the easiest characters to follow, the cast for the most part did a fine job, even if the dialogue can come off as stilted, as Snyder tries capturing that cold, harsh reality. I thought Matthew Good as Ozymandias wasn't bad, and Billy Crudup did what he could. It's just there's only so much he can do considering Dr. Manhattan's meant to be very monotone and robotic. On the other hand, I feel Wilson and Ackerman could have been a tad better. Now, I like them in general, but sometimes the way their lines were read, they didn't totally sell the two as being the most likable characters when they needed to be. And I know that partially has to do with the dialogue they have to work with, so there's that as well, and they got better as the film went on, but at first they were a bit hit and miss. It was the way they were written, along with their performances, that made them people I didn't immediately want to root for. Jackie Earle Haley, on the other hand, while not necessarily giving us the most likable character with Rorschach, did a really solid job overall. I think some of Rorschach's overly descriptive lines don't land as well in hindsight, but I think Haley did a really good job of making them as digestible as they could be. He was easily one of the better aspects of the movie, and Jeffrey Dean Morgan, while mainly seeing him just in flashbacks, was also good at really conveying how much of a despicable guy the comedian truly was. And also popping up in brief supporting roles were Carla Gugino as the original Silk Spectre, and Stephen McHattie as the original Night Owl, and I found them both to be pretty charismatic in the brief time they're on screen. Now, despite some character issues, I did like the sense of mystery built up over the course of the 2.5 hours, or 3 hours if you're watching the director's cut. Part of that is due to the fact that, more than anything else, Snyder does a top-notch job at capturing the unique world established by Moore in the original comics, with its distinct blend of pop culture utilized for much darker purposes. Now, there are some pacing issues as the film tries getting in as much as it possibly can when exploring the history of these characters, but the murder mystery aspect was easily the most engaging, and probably the most riveting part of the entire story. It's not always front and center, but we cut back to it often enough that it does manage to hold our attention, giving off the feel of an old noir film from the 40s, once again being another blending of genres in this mismatched world. And I do like how this deconstructs the superhero genre, and how it does show there'd probably be a lot of moral gray areas if superheroes really were around. It wouldn't be as simple as, say, the Avengers coming in and everyone would immediately love them and they'd work hand in hand with all the world's leaders with no butting of heads. As some other superhero movies have hinted, it would be a lot messier than that, even when it comes to the heroes who really are trying to do the right thing. And it probably would end with clashes similar to what we got here, with a lot of the messaging being muddled through all this interference. While it doesn't always make for something as grandiose and exciting as, say, one of the Marvel movies, and makes this something of a downer, I do like how it takes this different approach to the superhero genre, and how it goes hand in hand with real-world fears and concerns. And that's best seen in the film's climax, where it's revealed that the murders taking place throughout the film were all part of a larger plot by Ozymandias to unite the world on the brink of World War III against a common enemy, that being Dr. Manhattan. He winds up destroying cities, killing millions, and making it look like Dr. Manhattan caused it, and rationalizes that sacrificing millions would save billions from nuclear war. And the rest of the characters are presented with a moral conundrum when they see the worlds united, but it's all based on a lie that caused massive amounts of destruction. And as horrifying of an ending as it is, I think it does capture an extreme version of the ultimately twisted viewpoint we probably get if superheroes really were around. And I mean, if you need another example of how twisted things possibly can be, go watch The Boys, which is a great show, by the way. Again, it's something of a downer, but I do like this blending of real-world concerns and the superhero genre into something unique, to say the least. And for the record, I think it was a good thing they changed this from the comic book ending, which involved the world being united against a giant squid monster instead of Dr. Manhattan. Now, I know this review's been a little all over the place, but Watchmen isn't the easiest film to dissect. It's a story about moral ambiguity, deconstructing a very popular genre of storytelling, with characters who are either unlikable or emotionally distant, and presented in a very dark, gritty, realistic manner. And because of that, parts of the story simply just won't translate well to film, which are basically my issues with the movie. And also because of that, it may not be totally digestible to all audiences, especially those who aren't familiar with the original source material. But there are still plenty of things about it that work, and Snyder managed to capture that just about as best as he could, even if it doesn't result in a movie that I love. Watchmen really shined for me at a time when everyone wanted darker superhero movies. Over 10 years later, I may not love it as much as I once did, simply because the point of the story does lead to unlikable characters and it's not what I'm looking for in a movie anymore, but it's still a very well done film. It's visually stunning, with solid performances all around, and it offers an interesting deconstruction of superheroes, presenting us a world that would still be very morally complex, even if they actually existed. Its dark tone is definitely a bit much at times, but it does offer a number of really engaging scenarios, built around an old-fashioned murder mystery. It's still not a film for everyone, but I thought it was good, and one of Snyder's better releases. Watchmen gets a 7.5 out of 10. Now, this was the one I was most interested in revisiting of all of Zack Snyder's films because, like I said, at the time, I loved it. It kind of sucks when a movie you really enjoyed once kind of goes down a notch after you go back to it, but I was happy to see it was at least still good. Though stay tuned, up next will be my review of Legends of the Guardians, The Owls of Ga'Hoole. But in the meantime, let me know, did you see Watchmen, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Did you like this more than Zack Snyder's other movies? Did you like it less than them? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it, and for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching everyone, and keep having fun with film.